Today's homily for the 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time incorporates a mission appeal for the Little Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi who work in Africa. We hear in our first reading and in our gospel as well the overwhelming generosity of God towards his people. Elisha was a prophet who lived some 900 years before Christ, right after the time of Elijah. And we can say in a certain sense he inherited the prophetic ministry from the prophet Elijah when he was taken up into heaven. And we see in the first reading, Elisha was a miracle worker who could provide food for the hungry. He takes 20 barley loaves, which were made from the first harvest in the springtime, and is able to feed 100 people with it. His servant objected to the plan because the servant feared that there would not be enough food for all to eat. But Elisha, confident in God's generosity, commands that the loaves be given to the people, and he has the faith that God will provide. And he says, they will eat, and there will be food left over. We can see parallels in the New Testament between certain figures in the Old Testament, like the prophets, Elisha and Elijah. Parallels and fulfillment in Jesus, our Savior. At the Transfiguration, we see Jesus conversing with Moses, the lawgiver, and Elijah, the prophet. Jesus is the new lawgiver, and he fulfills all the prophecies of old. If you go to Israel someday, or perhaps you've been there, and you've climbed up or driven up to Mount Tabor, the mountain of the Transfiguration, also the mountain that's mentioned in today's gospel. And looking down from Mount Tabor, 2 miles to the south, is the village of Naim, where Jesus raised the widow's son as they were taking him out to be buried. And just nearby the village is where Elisha raised the boy from the dead. And so our gospel writers see parallels between the ministry of Jesus and those of great figures in the Old Testament. But they present Jesus as surpassing that ministry. The feeding of the 5,000 that we hear of today in the gospel has such parallels. Both Elisha and Jesus confront the problem of providing food for the hungry. Elisha takes 20 loaves and feeds 100. Jesus takes 5 loaves and a few fish and feeds 5,000. Who seems to be the greater one? Jesus. He feeds less with more. He can provide food for the body as well as the soul. For the feeding of the 5,000 prefigures the Eucharist, in which he gives us his very self, the bread of life. We also have one of Jesus' disciples objecting, much like the servant of Elisha. Philip, the one for whom this church is named, objects, saying, there's not enough money to buy food for all these people. And Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, says, there's only a few loaves and fish, but what good is that for so many people? Like Elisha, Jesus commands that the people be fed the food. Jesus takes the loaves, blesses them, and distributes them to the people. And in the case of Jesus, there are 12 baskets full of bread left over. And 12 was a symbolic number for the Jewish people, the 12 tribes of Israel. And for the Christians, the 12 apostles. What is the difference between the two stories? Jesus does more with less. And in both stories, we see that God is generous with his needy people. God gives more than we need or imagine, and there is some left over. There's more to God's gifts to us than we can take in. God is not somehow stingy with us, only giving just so much and no more. As Jesus tells us, when God gives something, It flows over, good measure, poured out. Today we reflect on how we also can be generous with those in need. Do you think the way Jesus thinks, who's able to create a miracle? Or do you think, like Philip and Andrew, it's useless to try to help so many people when we have so little? That's the way Philip was thinking. I hope that's not our thinking today. We just heard how God can make a miracle with the little that we have. We can make a miracle today for someone in need. Our second collection today will be for the Little Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi, who were founded in 1923 in Uganda by Mary Mother Kevin Carney, who's now a servant of God on her way to becoming a saint. She was a Franciscan missionary sister from Ireland, and since their founding, their institute has grown now, and the sisters do ministry in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and a few sisters in the United States. They have about 800 members in the LSOSF Institute. The sisters are asking for our prayers and financial support for their programs, especially for the children they care for, orphans, homeless street children, children with disabilities, young teenage mothers, refugees, and for their feeding programs for the poor, especially for the children and for single mothers who lack basic necessities. They are doing what Jesus did by feeding the hungry. Are we like Philip, who said, "Why bother trying to do something?" Or are we like Jesus, who said, "Feed the people"? Sister Nancy Kamau from Kenya has written to us to share that the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly affected the people there and the ministries that the sisters do with the poor and the marginalized. Unfortunately, due to the lockdown, many people were pushed into poverty, and children are the most affected. Currently, Africa is experiencing new waves of the pandemic in the countries of Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, where the sisters serve. During that COVID lockdown, people were told to stay at home, but the homeless street children had no home to return to and had to find refuge in the woods or under tunnels. During the lockdown restrictions, there was also a surge in child abuse and teenage pregnancies in many parts of Africa. With so many school-aged children becoming child mothers, the sisters have been reaching out to these vulnerable populations and advocating for the young teenage mothers and for the children who need our support. The sisters ask for our prayers, our financial support, so that the marginalized in their societies might be helped. They follow in the footsteps of St. Francis Assisi and Mother Kevin, their foundress. They seek to serve the marginalized, the homeless, orphans, children with disabilities, the youth, single mothers, children with HIV/AIDS, malnourished children, the elderly, and anybody who's affected by the pandemic. 2 of their sisters have died as a result of COVID-19, and yet the sisters continue to do their ministry for the poor. The sisters ask for our prayers and our financial support so that they can continue to care for the people entrusted to them. Your donation in the second collection will enable them to fulfill their mission of reaching out with compassion for the poor and the marginalized in their societies. They rely on people of goodwill to continue their missionary work. You are their hope, and no donation that you make is too small to make a difference. Thank you very much for listening to their appeal. On their part, the sisters will remember you in prayer. They will pray for you and all your loved ones for safety, protection, and good health. They will also pray for the healing of the world and all of humanity. May God bless you and reward your generosity and your kindness to the missionary work of the sisters.